Okay, this is now lecture 4 for EDD 939 Module 5, and we're going to start the next 2 or 3 lectures for this module. I'm not sure what it'll end up being. Are going to be looking at the strategic thinking competencies that the book talks about. But I want to talk about them. I'm not going to rehash what the book says. I'm probably going to be some overlap in things, but these are more my thoughts on these aspects, just to kind of build on what the book talks about. And so the first one is scanning. And scanning is going to connect us some with what we talked about in the last lecture about scenario planning, and then planning in general, and then also about servant leadership and that component of wisdom and organizational stewardship, particularly wisdom, where you're looking at what's going around on both inside and outside your organization and making informed choices, because that's really what scanning is about. And that's, I like the term scanning, because if you think about it, when you scan something, I scan the room looking for someone I know, or we talk about CAT scans and things like that. We're looking for things. And so we're kind of doing that check-in, that assessment, if you will. And so that's what I want you to think of when you think of the term scanning in regards to strategic thinking. And the first really concept there is, what is scanning? Well, it's taking frequent stock of environmental factors that can impact your business, both in the near and the far term. And when I'm talking about taking stock of something, again, we're just checking in and saying, okay, what's going on here? I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Environmental factors. I don't mean necessarily the natural environment, although depending on your business, depending on what you're doing, that may be a part of it, but environment as a whole. So if you're in a college, what's the higher ed environment, both locally as well as nationally? What's the business environment? If you're in a nonprofit, what's the current environment, both within, your particular. And I apologize if you hear my dog barking. Evidently, there's someone approaching our house. But if you our nonprofit, where do we work, and what's going to impact that? Just nonprofits as a whole, and what's going on as far as people donating money and things like that. So all of those things that can impact your business. And I use the term business. Again, I'm not talking necessarily about a for-profit business. We might be talking about, or what I'm talking about with business is just what you do, your business. So what are these environmental factors that they might impact our business? And again, both near and far term, we've got to be thinking about both. Too often we're only looking near term, and we're not thinking about those things coming down the road. Remember scenario planning. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, but sometimes people are good at looking far term, but they're not paying attention to the near term. And so we want to be doing both. So scanning is taking frequent stock of environmental factors that can impact your business, both in the near and in the far term. Now, one method that you can use, and the book does talk about this, is SWOT. And I'm guessing most, if not all of you, are fairly familiar with the SWOT method, SWOT approach. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that because, again, I think most of us at this point are probably fairly familiar with it. But that is a great way to scan what's going on. Now, I think the key part, if you use the SWOT method, is to make sure that you are looking both inside and outside. And I say that because a lot of times what I've seen teams or groups, departments, or even organizations as a whole do with the SWOT method is they only look internally. Now, this is one where sometimes all people do is look externally. And we're going to talk about that more when we get to systems thinking of uncovering, what's our own role in the problem, right? We have engaged the enemy and it is us. But what I find with the SWOT method is it can become too introspective, and we can run the risk of ignoring external threats to us and opportunities. And so we want to look at what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are the opportunities to expand, to grow that are out there, and then what are the threats? What are the threats that are external to us, to our environment? And again, or if people do think externally with threats, what I often see happening too is they view threats as competitors only, right? I have a list when I do, and I'm going to talk about environmental scanning in a minute, but when I do annual reports for the EDD program here at Clarkson, I don't do a SWOT per se, but I think through these things. I have a list of our competitor schools. Now most of them are also our benchmark schools that we use for accreditation. If you're not familiar with that concept, what we do is there are certain schools that we will compare ourselves to, and there's similar others. Meaning we are not going to, Clarkson College is not going to compare itself to Harvard, right? We're in two very different groups. So we compare ourselves to similar schools, so there are benchmark schools, but most of those are also our competitors. And so, but a lot of times with the SWOT method with threats, we're only looking at our competitors. Oh, they're running a new marketing program, or they're getting ready to highlight a new product or a new certificate program or something. Those are not our only threats. There are more threats to what we do than just our competitors. And we need to be thinking through those. With higher ed right now, COVID-19 is a real threat. And I don't mean the virus itself. I mean, that's a threat. But what I mean is how people have responded and reacted, as well as the economic impact. And so what we see schools doing is, and Clarkson did this, freezing tuition for next year. University of Nebraska-Lincoln, they've frozen tuition for the next 2 years. And this is where you need to be thinking, though, both near and far term. I'm not saying it's a bad idea to freeze tuition for this next year, or even for 2 years. What I am saying is, if we've made that decision, have we considered what the long-term impact of that decision will be? That's what we're doing when we're doing effective scanning. And this is where a lot of times I see teams, groups, organizations making the decision in the short term and not considering the long-term ramifications. And so that's what we want to be looking at. So the SWOT is one method. Environmental scanning is another method. And this is one that you may not be as familiar with it. We actually have a component. When I do the annual report for the EDD program, there is a section that says environmental scan. And I write up what I did underneath that to scan the environment. And it's, again, both internal and external. What's going on internally and what's going on around us. And what I consider with the environmental scan, for just to use the EDD program for Clarkson College, as I mentioned, I'm looking at our benchmark institutions. I'm looking at those that are competitors. And I'm looking both locally, so the greater kind of Omaha, Council Bluffs, Lincoln, Des Moines general area. And I realize, Des Moines 3 hours, well, I guess from Omaha it's 2 hours away. But, but still that kind of broader area. But then I also look nationally. What else is going on nationally from competitors? Because, we're an online program and many of you are not in the local area. We're not a brick and mortar program. And so I have to consider what's going on nationally. So environmental scanning. And so one of the questions that you would ask under this is, do you know what your peers / competitors are doing? Again, they might be benchmark institutions. They might be competitor institutions. Most of them are probably going to be both. But do you know what your peers or / competitors are doing? And is this something that you should explore? And again, I'm using a lot of higher ed illustrations because that's my world that I live in right now. And I think many of you are in a teaching position, but we need to be looking at those things. But it can also apply to other kind of business settings. And the follow-up question is that, so the question is, do you know what they're doing? The follow-up question that I always like to ask connected with that is, as I'm doing this environmental scan, is that something then that we should explore? Is that something I should explore for our program? Because just because they're doing it, and this is another real danger when we get into this from a decision-making planning standpoint is, oh, our competitor is doing X. We need to do that. I'm going to run the risk of giving you an example that hopefully none of you leave our program over this and say, ooh, I need to find another program. But if you did your research on EDD programs, you probably encountered this. Some EDD programs are, now bear with me because I'm going to explain something. They're doing away with the dissertation. Now, before you all drop out of the class and drop out of the program and go find a program that doesn't have a dissertation, let me tell you, in my opinion, it's a bit of a marketing shell game when they say they don't have a dissertation. Because what they do have is they have an academically rigorous applied research program or project is how they'll put it. Translation, for those EDD programs that say they don't have a dissertation, it's we don't have a dissertation. They have a dissertation. We actually had this in our graduate program when I taught at Bob Jones. Students could take one of two options. And this was on purpose for us. It wasn't it was a selling point, but they could do an applied research project or a traditional thesis. And we had some students early on, and the reason we had it is because some were looking at going on to doctoral programs, and we would encourage them, you should probably do the thesis because it's good prep. For those who are looking at, I'm going straight from here, I want the master's and I'm going straight into the career field, probably won't get a doctorate if I do, it's way down the road. You might want to consider the applied research project because it could be a nice thing that you carry into an interview, things like that. But what we had early on is we had some students who admittedly told us, I'm choosing the applied research project because it's easier. All of them, without fail, came back to us at the end because they all had to present their findings, whether they did a thesis or applied research. All of those who did the applied research project kind of came in with this harried look, just like the thesis students, and they're like, I thought this was going to be easier. It was just as much work. Yeah, it's just different kind of work, but it's just as much work. So I just say that a little bit defensive about Clarkson, admittedly, but my point is this. Those are the kind of things that when I look and I see what competitors are doing. And so I'll bring it back and we'll have a discussion from time to time with our vice president of academics as well as some other faculty. Say, hey, other programs, they've eliminated the dissertation. What do you all think? Consistently, our viewpoint is keep the dissertation. One, because again, I don't think it's you still have a big project to do. Plus that too, I think there's value in doing research from a dissertation standpoint, and it can still be applied, right? And so anyway, I'm going to get off that soapbox for right now. But you see what I'm saying. So a scan doesn't just say, what are my competitors doing? Oh, they're eliminating the dissertation out of their EDD program. Oh, we should do that too because maybe they're getting students and we want to get more students. No, you then have to ask the question that says, so is that something we should consider? Well, they're lowering tuition. Okay. That doesn't mean we should. I mean, what are the other fees and everything else involved? Plus that, Maybe they have a huge grant, we don't. You see where I'm going with that. But unfortunately, what happens, especially in a highly competitive environment like higher ed, like we are now, what can happen is, well, if they're doing this, we need to do it too. We saw this happening, and I think this has died down some. It seemed more early 2000s that this was happening. So much emphasis got placed on student experience, which there should be a good emphasis on that for colleges. But what was happening was colleges were like building all of these really great, facilities for students to relax in and recreate in and everything else. And what you saw then was smaller colleges saying, we need to do that too. And they were driving themselves into debt, and some of them didn't survive because, we've got to offer all of the bells and whistles that a really big school does. No, students are choosing to go to a smaller school for a reason. It's not because you have a water slide, right? So anyway, you get the idea. So you're going to ask what your peers, your competitors are doing. You're also going to ask with environmental scanning, do you know where tech is heading, right? Those are and these aren't the only questions. These are just examples of questions you would ask. So do we know where technology is heading? What plans should we be making now to accommodate those changes that are coming in technology? Do you know where legislation is heading, where social currents are heading? I think of, and I want to be careful here because I'm not in the healthcare business, and so I'm not knocking on people. Maybe everyone was well prepared for it, but I think I heard from some who were in healthcare where when the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare was passed, and then when it came in, it caused some consternation from having to change a billing and there were some practices, things like any new legislation is doing it. That's not a reflection on the ACA or anyone. That's the way it is. But here's where I'm going with this. If there was a healthcare organization out there that was caught flat-footed and off guard when that thing passed and said, whoa, and then they weren't paying attention. And I don't just mean even to the legislation, the whole debate leading up to the passing of the legislation. I'm talking about back to the 1990s. That was a big movement. First spouses often will have a kind of thing that they go for, that they, that's their kind of pet project. And for Hillary Clinton, it was basically the forerunner of the Affordable Care Act. And not to mention, not just her in the 90s, but even then into early 2000s, from both parties, you were hearing constantly about, we need healthcare reform. We need healthcare reform. What's that going to look like? And so, point being, if I'm doing scanning all the way along, I should be, when that happens, I'm like, yeah, we knew this was coming because that's the way the social currents, and we even saw some early legislation happening. So we're prepared then to adapt and adjust where we should be better prepared. And I hope that makes sense. And again, that's not a reflection. Please don't now email me. You don't understand. I don't, because I wasn't in healthcare or in politics. But point being, if you were paying attention, you could see that we were trending that direction. And so those are the kind of things we want to be doing as we're scanning. And last couple points, and then we'll wrap up with this one. Just the idea, and I mentioned this already, some organizations are good at the long term, but they're not as good at the short term. So they can do great long-term planning, but they don't know how to adapt and change in the short term, or vice versa. They're really good at the immediate and the short term, but they've given no thought to the long term. And a lot of times with that long term versus short term, what we see happening is too, it isn't just that changes happen, but they're really good at setting out a vision. But how do we get there? I think of just an illustration. If I'm planning an outdoor party next week, right? I've looked ahead and I've looked at the weather and I said, next Friday night's going to be great weather. Let's have an outdoor party in our backyard. As restrictions are lifting and, we can have a certain number over. Let's have a party in our backyard. Great. So I've got that goal set, but there's a lot of stuff I need to do in the short term, right? We need to plan a menu. We need to invite people. I need to do some, I'll tell you I need to do some yard work in the backyard, clean up some things, trim some bushes, things like that, right? I mean, so there's a lot of stuff that has to happen. Just because I've set the goal out there doesn't mean that eureka on Friday everything magically appears. And I'm also paying attention in what might affect it, right? Because things pop up and all of a sudden, we get busy and I don't get to the store, or then the weather changes. And so we're constantly monitoring. And the application that I see for this is the assessment process within higher education. And so, and I mentioned this already, but your annual reports should include a bigger picture scan of the environment. Ours is built in. It says environmental scan. And I'm thankful for that because it's a good reminder every year. Write that in. So, you've got that in your annual reports. And then the ongoing assessment of the program and the courses within the program tells us how things are going and what adjustments need to be made. And so the assessment process really is part of the ongoing scanning that we're doing. We're scanning the environment from a big picture, probably more on an annual basis. And then we're also doing scanning from assessment standpoint, maybe more on a semester basis. And that may happen more at a year by year, but we're also at least tuned in. And so those are just some examples of how most of us are actually doing scanning. We just may not realize it, and how it can be very helpful in our strategic thinking. Because again, you see how it's helping our mindset. It isn't just doing it, but it's helping us with the mindset involved in saying what's going on, what are the trends, what are the issues, and things like that. So we'll pick up there with our next lecture when we talk about visioning.